In the vast reaches of the galaxy, wars among alien species were a constant. The Ctheran Empire, known for its ruthless expansion and unmatched military power, had long established itself as the dominant force. Their rule was cemented through fear. Entire civilizations fell before them, their leaders bending the knee after witnessing the overwhelming might of the Ctheran fleet. Subjugation was not just common, it was expected. Fear was their primary weapon, wielded as effectively as any laser cannon. Over the years, the Ctheran had built an empire on the submission of weaker species. Entire planets became slaves to their rule, each falling in line after a single demand: surrender or face annihilation. Most races didn't even need to see the full power of the Ctheran war machine to know that resistance was futile. Those that tried to fight back were quickly erased, their civilizations reduced to ash and forgotten among the stars. The message was clear: stand against the Ctheran, and your people will be wiped from existence. When the Galactic Council first discovered Earth, a small blue planet tucked away in a quiet corner of the galaxy, it seemed like just another easy target for the Ctheran to add to their growing collection. The humans were seen as primitive, backward, and hopelessly underdeveloped compared to the vast technological prowess of the galaxy's other species. They didn't have the advanced weaponry or sophisticated defenses that most of the Council species possessed. They hadn't yet ventured beyond their own solar system in any significant way. In the eyes of the Ctheran, humanity wasn't even worth considering a serious opponent. The Ctheran fleet was dispatched to Earth with a single objective: make the humans submit. It was routine for them by now. Their fleets had conquered hundreds of planets, each one crumbling the moment they saw the scale of the Ctheran power. The lead commander, a seasoned veteran of countless campaigns, sent the standard ultimatum to Earth's governments: surrender immediately or face total destruction. The fleet waited, orbiting the outer reaches of the solar system, fully expecting humanity to send back a plea for mercy, like so many had before. But Earth's response wasn't what they expected. There was no panic, no desperate attempt to negotiate. Instead, the humans responded with one simple word: no. It wasn't a defiant speech or a declaration of war. Just a single, calm refusal. The Ctheran commander was taken aback. How could a species so obviously outmatched show such indifference? Surely, they didn't understand the gravity of their situation. He ordered a follow-up transmission, laying out the dire consequences in more explicit terms. He made sure to emphasize that their refusal would lead to the complete and utter annihilation of their planet. The Ctheran had never needed to send a second warning before, but this was an exception. Again, Earth's response was the same: no. Confusion quickly turned to anger. The commander, who had never before been refused, felt a strange sense of unease creeping into his thoughts. The Ctheran were used to seeing fear in their enemies. Fear was a universal constant. It transcended languages and cultures. Yet here was a species that seemed either too foolish to understand their situation or too stubborn to admit defeat. The commander couldn't decide which one it was. But either way, the solution was clear: Earth needed to be made an example of. He ordered the full invasion of Earth. The fleet began its approach, preparing for what should have been a routine operation. This wasn't the first time a species had delayed their surrender, though none had lasted long after the Ctheran forces landed. The commander was confident that once the humans saw the true scale of their forces, they would beg for mercy. They always did. The Ctheran fleet moved through space toward Earth, passing the outer planets of the solar system with their massive warships casting long shadows over the distant moons. Each ship was packed with weapons designed to level cities, decimate armies, and obliterate any resistance. The Ctheran Empire prided itself on its efficiency. They could wipe out a planet's defenses within hours if need be, and the humans were unlikely to last even that long. Yet, as the fleet drew closer, something gnawed at the commander's mind. The humans' response lingered, their complete lack of fear unsettling. He had crushed hundreds of worlds and had seen countless species break under the weight of their own terror. The Ctheran thrived on the submission of their enemies. But there was no fear coming from Earth. The humans weren't panicking. They weren't even attempting to negotiate. That single word, no, echoed louder than any threat he had ever received. The commander tried to dismiss the thought, reassuring himself that fear would soon take hold once the humans saw the Ctheran armada in full force. No species had ever stood against the might of the Ctheran and lived to tell the tale. It was only a matter of time before the humans realized their mistake. But deep down, a small part of him wondered if, this time, things might be different. As the fleet prepared to break orbit and begin the assault on Earth, the humans remained quiet, as if they were waiting for something. The Ctheran invasion was meant to be swift, brutal, and decisive. The commander gave the order, confident that humanity's defiance would soon crumble like all the rest. Yet, despite his bravado, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to face an enemy unlike any he had encountered before. And for the first time in his long career, the commander felt something he had never known before, a flicker of fear. The Ctheran invasion of Earth began with the kind of calculated precision they were known for. Their fleet, a sprawling array of massive warships and dreadnoughts, descended on Earth like a dark cloud blotting out the stars. They expected the typical reaction: panic, disorganization, surrender. Instead, they found a planet prepared to resist, not with grand displays of power, but with an unsettling calm that unsettled the Ctheran soldiers. As the first waves of the invasion fleet entered Earth's atmosphere, the Ctheran commanders quickly realized that this wouldn't be the simple conquest they had expected. Human forces didn't retreat or scatter in fear. Instead, they adapted immediately. Using Earth's varied terrain, human soldiers moved like shadows through forests, mountains, and cities. Guerrilla tactics, something the Ctheran hadn't anticipated, proved devastatingly effective against their larger, more cumbersome war machines. The initial battles were fierce, but humanity's tactics were anything but traditional. The Ctheran, with their overwhelming numbers and firepower, expected humans to crumble under the sheer pressure. Yet the humans fought back in ways that the invaders had never seen before. Instead of digging into fortified positions, human soldiers moved fluidly, disappearing into dense forests or underground bunkers, only to emerge where the Ctheran least expected them. In close-quarters combat, humans fought with a fierceness that the Ctheran had never encountered. Their willingness to engage in battle despite being heavily outgunned shocked the invaders. Human soldiers charged into the fight with little regard for their own safety, refusing to retreat even when faced with certain death. What the Ctheran mistook for desperation was actually something far more terrifying: resolve. And it wasn't just the soldiers. Civilians, too, were part of the resistance. Instead of fleeing, entire cities mobilized, turning their urban environments into tactical traps. Streets became battlefields, with every building, alley, and sewer system used to their advantage. The Ctheran found themselves bogged down in urban warfare, fighting an enemy that refused to show fear. The Ctheran had always relied on psychological warfare to crush their enemies. Fear was their greatest weapon, and they wielded it with expert precision. But Earth was different. Where fear had broken other species, humanity seemed immune. Worse, it wasn't just that humans didn't succumb to fear, they appeared to thrive in its presence. It was as if the constant threat of death only sharpened their resolve. In battle after battle, the Ctheran forces were met with human soldiers who smiled as they charged, laughed as they fought, and embraced death with an unsettling calm. Ctheran commanders reported seeing human soldiers refuse to retreat, even when surrounded. They fought until their last breath, not out of desperation, but out of defiance. Some even smiled in their final moments, a sight that began to haunt the Ctheran troops. Human soldiers fought as if they had nothing to lose. It unnerved the Ctheran, who were used to breaking their enemies long before the fighting began. The invaders watched as their forces struggled to push through what should have been simple defenses, only to find human resistance growing stronger with every battle. The Ctheran commander, observing the chaos from the safety of his flagship, was forced to admit something he had never considered before: humanity wasn't afraid of them. This realization was deeply troubling for the Ctheran. They had built their empire on the concept of fear, and their tactics had always revolved around causing psychological collapse before physical destruction. But the humans were different. Instead of folding under the pressure, they adapted. Instead of retreating, they advanced. Instead of fearing death, they seemed to welcome it. The Ctheran began to experience something they hadn't felt in centuries: doubt. Reports from the battlefield spoke of human soldiers launching near-suicidal attacks on Ctheran strongholds, obliterating entire platoons with nothing more than sheer audacity. Human pilots flew into dogfights against superior Ctheran ships, outmaneuvering them with reckless abandon, often sacrificing themselves to take down larger targets. It wasn't desperation driving these tactics. It was a kind of fearlessness that the Ctheran couldn't comprehend. With each passing day, the Ctheran lost more ground. Their war machine, so used to rolling over enemies without resistance, began to falter. Human resilience wasn't just a matter of tactics, it was psychological. Every time a human soldier faced death and didn't flinch, it sent ripples through the Ctheran ranks. Their soldiers, who had been bred to see themselves as invincible, were shaken by the sight of an enemy that didn't know fear. Humanity's culture, rooted in centuries of warfare, survival, and the belief in sacrifice for the greater good, was something the Ctheran had never encountered before. Human history was filled with stories of small forces overcoming great odds, of individuals standing against impossible challenges. Now, in the face of galactic annihilation, those same qualities were on full display. What truly separated humanity from every other species the Ctheran had encountered was their willingness to take risks no one else would. Their fearlessness gave them a tactical edge that no amount of Ctheran firepower could overcome. Human commanders ordered bold strikes against the Ctheran fleet, hitting supply lines and command centers in coordinated, high-risk operations. These attacks were devastating, not because they were flawless, but because the humans executed them without hesitation, even when success seemed unlikely. As the battles dragged on, the Ctheran soldiers began to hesitate. They had always relied on their enemies breaking first, but humanity didn't break. Human forces moved forward relentlessly, their morale seeming to rise with each passing day. Ctheran commanders reported entire units freezing in combat, unable to understand why the humans continued to fight when their own forces would have surrendered long ago. The Ctheran invasion, which had been expected to last mere days, was now in complete disarray. The once confident fleet was scattered, retreating from key positions as human forces pressed their advantage. For the first time in the Ctheran Empire's long history, they were being pushed back by an enemy they had grossly underestimated. The Ctheran commander, watching the battle unfold from his command ship, realized the full extent of his mistake. He had come to Earth expecting a simple victory, a routine conquest like so many before. But what he had encountered was something far worse than resistance. He had encountered a species that didn't fear death. And now, his once mighty invasion force was on the verge of collapse. The war between humanity and the Ctheran dragged on far longer than anyone could have anticipated. What was meant to be a swift and decisive conquest had turned into a drawn-out conflict that tested the limits of both species. The Ctheran, growing increasingly frustrated, escalated their attacks. They deployed more advanced weaponry, devices capable of mass destruction that had crushed countless civilizations before. They altered their tactics, adapting to human strategies and focusing on wiping out entire regions at once rather than engaging in direct combat. But none of it worked. Every time the Ctheran thought they had humanity cornered, the humans found a way to push back. The Ctheran believed that the escalating violence would break human morale, that the mounting casualties would force them to surrender. Instead, humanity only grew more determined. What the Ctheran failed to understand was that humans had always thrived under pressure. The more desperate the situation became, the more inventive humanity grew. Human scientists and engineers began to reverse engineer captured Ctheran technology, transforming it into something even more dangerous. Weapons designed to subjugate weaker species were repurposed and modified, becoming tools of human resistance. The Ctheran were baffled. How could a species so primitive adapt so quickly? But that was humanity's strength, their ability to evolve, to innovate under threat, to turn their enemies' tools against them. It wasn't just the technology, though. Humanity had another weapon, something the Ctheran couldn't counter: fearlessness. As the war ground on, humanity began to understand that their lack of fear could be used to their advantage. Ktheran troops were starting to crack under the relentless onslaught of an enemy that didn't know when to stop. Reports from the front lines described Ktheran soldiers retreating in the face of human forces, not because they were outmatched, but because they were unnerved. Human intelligence agents began broadcasting messages deep into Ktheran communication channels. These messages weren't filled with threats, but with taunts, preying on the Ktheran's growing fear of the humans. The psychological warfare was relentless. Where the Ktheran had once used fear to dominate, humanity now used it to erode the very foundation of the Empire. Human soldiers, calm and collected in the heat of battle, became the stuff of legend. They didn't flinch. They didn't run. They moved forward, as if death was merely a nuisance to be brushed aside. In space, human pilots faced down entire Ktheran fleets with the same unshakable calm. The Ktheran had superior ships, more advanced weapons, and greater numbers, but human pilots flew as if they were invincible. Their tactics, once thought reckless, became a symbol of defiance. Human squadrons would dive headfirst into battles they had no business surviving, yet time and time again, they emerged victorious. It wasn't their technology that gave them the edge, it was their fearlessness. Ktheran pilots began to second-guess themselves in battle, hesitating where they once would have attacked without mercy. And in war, hesitation was fatal. As the Ktheran forces continued to falter, human losses mounted. Entire battalions were wiped out in the pursuit of victory. But instead of these losses breaking humanity's resolve, they became symbols of hope. Stories of soldiers who gave their lives to save their comrades spread like wildfire. These weren't tales of despair, but of courage, of unshakable determination in the face of impossible odds. Heroes emerged from the ashes of war, not because of their strength or skill, but because of their refusal to succumb to fear. Their names became rallying cries for new recruits, who eagerly joined the fight to honor the fallen. Each sacrifice, each loss, only made humanity stronger. The Ktheran couldn't understand it. In every other species they had conquered, death had been a tool to instill fear, to force submission. But for humanity, death was merely the price they were willing to pay for their freedom. The more they lost, the harder they fought. And this attitude, this fearlessness, began to spread beyond Earth. Other species, long oppressed by the Ktheran, began to take notice. Word of humanity's resistance reached far corners of the galaxy. Species who had once bowed to the Ktheran now saw a chance for something greater. They saw in humanity a strength they had never known themselves. And slowly, rebellions began to spark across the Empire. Minor uprisings at first, easily quelled, but they grew in number and intensity as the war dragged on. The Ktheran found themselves fighting on multiple fronts, their once unquestioned superiority slipping through their fingers. The Ktheran Empire, once the dominant force in the galaxy, was starting to fracture. Their troops, once feared across the stars, were losing morale. Their fleets, once unmatched, were being outmaneuvered. And all the while, humanity pressed forward, fearless, relentless. The Ktheran commander, once so confident in his empire's superiority, now found himself facing an impossible enemy. This wasn't just about defeating a species anymore, it was about defeating an idea. Humanity had shown the galaxy that fear could be overcome. That death, once the ultimate weapon of control, was nothing compared to the power of defiance. The Ktheran commander knew he was no longer fighting just humans. He was fighting against a belief that had spread far beyond Earth, a belief that no empire could control. As the pressure mounted, the commander faced an impossible dilemma. He could withdraw, cutting his losses and potentially saving what remained of his empire. But that would mean admitting defeat to a species he had once deemed inferior. It would mean that fear, the very thing his empire had thrived on, had been rendered powerless. Or, he could continue the fight, pouring more resources into a war against an enemy that knew no fear, risking total collapse in the process. The commander stared out at the stars, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. The Ktheran Empire was teetering on the edge, and humanity had proven that their greatest weapon wasn't their technology, or their numbers. It was their fearlessness in the face of death, a power that no empire, no matter how mighty, could ever hope to control. The final phase of the war between humanity and the Ctheran Empire unfolded in a way no one could have predicted. The Ctheran, once the most feared and dominant force in the galaxy, had been brought to the edge of collapse, not through superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but by the relentless resolve of humanity. What had started as a simple conquest had become a war of survival for the Ctheran, and they were losing. Humanity had spent years learning, adapting, and growing stronger with each battle. Their tactics evolved, their forces became more cohesive, and they gained a deep understanding of their enemy's weaknesses. It was no longer just about fighting for Earth. Humanity had set their sights on something bigger. The Ctheran homeworld, once considered untouchable, was now their ultimate target. Taking it would mean the end of the Empire, a symbolic victory as much as a military one. The assault on the Ctheran homeworld was a bold, audacious plan, the kind of operation no other species would have dared attempt. But humanity, fueled by their refusal to be subjugated, had proven time and again that they were not bound by fear. Their fleets, still outmatched technologically, gathered in force and launched the most coordinated attack the galaxy had ever seen. The Ctheran, crippled by their losses and their growing internal dissent, struggled to mount a defense. Their commanders, once decisive and ruthless, now hesitated, second-guessing every order. As the human forces made landfall on the Ctheran capital, it became clear that the tide had fully turned. Ctheran soldiers, who had once fought with arrogance and brutality, faltered in the face of an enemy that refused to retreat, even in the direst of circumstances. Human soldiers pressed forward with an intensity that shook the very core of the Ctheran defenders. Every step toward the heart of the Ctheran capital was a testament to humanity's resilience. They knew many of them wouldn't survive the battle, but that knowledge didn't deter them. It only fueled their determination. In the streets of the Ctheran capital, human soldiers fought with a purpose beyond mere victory. They were fighting for the survival of their species, for the freedom they had refused to relinquish from the start. The Ctheran civilians, who had never seen combat up close, were stunned. They had been raised to believe that fear was the ultimate weapon, that submission was the natural order of things. But now, they were witnessing the collapse of their empire at the hands of a species that did not cower in the face of death. The Ctheran government, desperate to salvage what remained of their empire, attempted to negotiate. They sent envoys to the human commanders, offering terms of peace, promising concessions in exchange for an end to the fighting. But humanity had no interest in negotiation. They weren't here to make deals. They were here to end an empire built on fear and oppression. The time for diplomacy had passed. With their government paralyzed by fear and their military in shambles, the Ctheran Empire collapsed from within. Their fleets, once the symbol of their invincibility, were scattered and broken. Their soldiers, demoralized and overwhelmed, either surrendered or fled. What had once been the most powerful empire in the galaxy was now nothing more than a fractured remnant of its former self. But humanity's victory was not just a military triumph. It was an ideological one. The fall of the Ctheran Empire was a turning point for the entire galaxy. Other species, long oppressed by the Ctheran's rule, began to rise up, inspired by humanity's defiance. The very nature of galactic warfare changed. No longer was fear the dominant weapon. No longer could empires rule through intimidation alone. Humanity had shown that fear could be overcome, that death was not the end, but a part of the struggle for freedom. In the aftermath of the Ctheran collapse, the galaxy began to shift. Species that had once lived in fear of the Ctheran now began to adopt human strategies of resistance and resilience. The Ctheran, once the overlords of the galaxy, were now forced to live among the very species they had oppressed. They became refugees in a galaxy they had once ruled with an iron fist. For many, it was a bitter irony, once the most feared species in the galaxy, now powerless in the wake of humanity's rise. Humanity's influence spread far beyond their own planet. They became a symbol of courage and strength, their fearlessness in the face of impossible odds inspiring entire generations across the galaxy. They were no longer seen as just another species. They were legends, their story told and retold on distant worlds. Their victory wasn't about conquering territory or gaining resources. It was about proving that no empire, no matter how powerful, could stand against a people who refused to be afraid. The Ctheran remnants, those who survived the war, were scattered across the galaxy, forced to rebuild their lives under the shadow of their former enemies. But the galaxy had changed. No longer would fear be the driving force of control. The Ctheran had built their empire on the belief that fear could conquer all, but humanity had shown that fearlessness could topple even the mightiest of empires. In the years that followed, humanity's story became the foundation for a new era of galactic history. Their tactics, their resilience, and their refusal to bend in the face of death became the standard by which future conflicts were measured. Other species, once afraid to challenge the status quo, now saw that the path to victory wasn't through fear, but through courage and unyielding resolve. The legacy of humanity's victory was not just in the collapse of the Ctheran Empire, but in the fundamental shift in the way the galaxy viewed power. It wasn't about who had the most advanced weapons or the largest fleets. It was about who had the will to fight, even when the odds were impossible. And in that, humanity had proven themselves to be the strongest species in the galaxy. Their fearlessness in the face of death became the stuff of legend. It was told in hushed tones across distant planets, taught in military academies, and immortalized in the annals of galactic history. Humanity's greatest weapon had never been their technology or their numbers, it had been their unshakable courage, their refusal to submit, and their willingness to face death head-on. In the end, it was this fearlessness that changed the galaxy forever. And it was this same fearlessness that would ensure humanity's place as a beacon of strength and resilience for generations to come.